They say you should never speak ill of the dead, but my husband wasn't just dead. He was an architect of ruin. He built a beautiful cage for his family and convinced the world it was a palace. Now his children, my children, were trying to lock the final door and throw away the key. But they forgot one thing. I was there when he laid the first stone. I know where all the bodies are buried, and before this is over, they'll wish they'd just let me fade away. If you believe a woman's silence is weakness, then you need to hear this story. Follow, like, and hit that notification bell, because the quiet ones are the ones you should fear the most. My story doesn't begin with a death, but with a celebration. A lie plated in gold. It was my son Ethan and my daughter Isabella's 25th wedding anniversary. A silver jubilee. It sounded so grand, so permanent. Our cliffside mansion in Carmel by the Sea was buzzing, the kind of expensive, managed hum that costs a fortune to orchestrate. Below us, the Pacific Ocean crashed against the rocks, a beautiful, violent sound I knew too well. It was the only honest thing I'd heard in days. For weeks, the event had been a carefully curated spectacle on their social media. Isabella, a master of the personal brand, had plastered it all over Instagram, Twitter, even that ridiculous TikTok platform Leo, my grandson, had tried to explain to me. #legacy of love. #Carmel royalty. 25 years. Strong. The photos showed a smiling, perfect family, the kind you see in advertisements for legacy wealth or prescription medication. And there I was in most of them, Sophia, the graceful matriarch, a silver-haired ghost at the edge of the frame. My smile was a work of art, a mask I had perfected over 50 years of practice. I could hold it for hours, my facial muscles aching, while my mind was screaming. I smiled when the cameras flashed. I smiled when a business associate of Ethan's, a man with a suntan like polished leather, squeezed my hand and told me how wonderfully preserved I was, as if I were a jar of jam. I moved through the crowd, a phantom in my own home. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, a cloying combination that stuck in the back of my throat. People I'd known for decades looked at me with a soft, pitying gaze. They saw what my children wanted them to see. A relic. A fragile old woman who was lucky to be so well cared for. They'd nod and say, "Sophia, you look lovely." But their eyes said, "Poor thing, she must be so confused." I'd just nod back, offering them that placid, empty smile. It was easier than fighting the narrative. For now, I needed a moment of silence, a breath of air that wasn't recycled through a central HVAC system and scented with lies. I slipped away from the main salon, my soft-soled shoes making no sound on the imported marble floors. I intended to go to the library, my one sanctuary, but the sound of voices stopped me. My children's voices. They were tucked away in the shadows of the grand staircase, a dramatic, sweeping structure David had insisted upon, designed for entrances and pronouncements. It was also, apparently, perfect for conspiracies. I flattened myself against the cool plaster of the wall, hidden by a ridiculously large potted fern. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, not at first. It was instinct. The same instinct that had taught me to read the mood of a room the moment I entered it, to gauge my husband David's temper by the way he set down his briefcase. It was the instinct of a survivor. "Everything is going perfectly," Isabella was saying, her voice a low, satisfied murmur. Catherine from Lux Living magazine is practically writing the article in her head. She loved the story about our first date. "Of course she did," Ethan replied. His voice, once that of my little boy, now had the hard, polished edge of a CEO closing a deal. It was his father's voice. "It's a great story. Inspiring." I felt a bitter taste rise in my mouth. Inspiring. The carefully constructed myth of their love story, a tale spun for public consumption, was another one of David's projects. "The caterer was a good call," Isabella continued, a rustle of silk suggesting she was adjusting her dress. "And the lighting is perfect. Everyone looks 10 years younger." A pause. Except maybe her. Her me, the unnamed problem. Ethan sighed. It was a long-suffering sound, a performance for his wife. "I know, Izzy. Just a little longer. We have to handle this delicately." "Delicately?" Isabella's whisper sharpened. Ethan, she almost called the caterer to ask if the shrimp was locally sourced. In front of Catherine, she's losing it. It's becoming a liability. She's not losing it, she's just old, he said. The word old sounding like a diagnosis of a terminal disease. Look, the market is hot right now, red hot. We can get at least 20 million for this place, maybe 22 if we stage it right. We can't do that with her wandering around moving things. My blood ran cold. 20 million. The price tag for my life, my home. It's for the best, Izzy, he said, his voice softening into the tone he used when he was being reasonable. The one that meant the decision was already made. Seaview Meadows is top of the line. They have a watercolor class. She'd like that. It's for her own good. She's fading. Fading. The word hung in the air between them, absolute and final. It was a judgment, a verdict. I leaned my head back against the wall, the cold plaster a small, sharp shock to my system. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. A strange, calm clarity washed over me. For 50 years, I had been a ghost in this house, a supporting character in the grand drama of the family my husband had built. I had faded into the wallpaper, into the background of photographs, into the role of the quiet, agreeable wife and mother. I let them believe it because it was safer. But standing there, in the shadows of the staircase that felt like the spine of some great, dead beast, I knew they were wrong. I wasn't fading. I was focusing. After they left, their laughter echoing from the driveway as they got into their gleaming Tesla, the house was silent except for the ghosts. And in this house, the ghosts were loud. My late husband, David, was the chief ghost, the architect of this house and our lives. The silence he left behind wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, an oppressive blanket woven with the threads of his will. To the world, he was David Thorne, the charismatic real estate magnate who carved empires out of California coastline. To us, he was a god, a quiet, unsmiling deity whose scripture was written in blueprints and closing statements. He didn't need to raise his voice. He never did. His disappointment was a physical force, a change in the atmospheric pressure of a room that could suck the air from your lungs. He could kill a conversation with a single raised eyebrow. He could wither your confidence with a quiet, thoughtful, "Is that what you really think?" I remember once, when Ethan was about 12, he'd brought home a painting from art class, a vibrant, chaotic splash of color. He was so proud. He held it up for his father to see. David looked at it for a long time, his head tilted. Then he said, "The lines are undisciplined, son. Greatness requires control." Ethan never painted again. He channeled all that energy into the Junior Achievement Club and later the Wharton School of Business. He learned control. I walked through the cavernous living room, my reflection sliding across the polished black granite of the fireplace. David had chosen it. "It absorbs the light," he'd said. "It makes the fire seem brighter." What it really did was make the room feel like a void, a black hole that swallowed warmth and comfort. Every object, every surface, was a testament to his taste, his control. The sofas were a severe, minimalist style in a shade of white that was impossible to live with, a constant, silent rebuke to any form of mess or relaxation. The art on the walls was abstract, expensive, and cold. It wasn't meant to be enjoyed, it was meant to be noted, an asset listed on an insurance policy. My gaze fell on the main family portrait, hanging over the mantel. It was taken 10 years ago, a year before David died. He sat in the center, of course, a king on his throne-like armchair. Ethan stood behind him, his hand on his father's shoulder, a prince mimicking the posture of the monarch. Isabella and I were seated on either side, arranged for symmetry. In the photo, David is looking directly at the camera, but his smile doesn't reach his eyes. There's a look in them, a look I only understood much later. It was a look of profound, unsettling satisfaction, like a master craftsman admiring his finished, flawless creation. And that creation wasn't the house. It was them, Ethan and Isabella. I remember how he'd praised their bond, his voice laced with that strange, proprietary pride that always chilled me to the bone. Even when they were teenagers, he encouraged their closeness in a way that felt unnatural. Other parents worried about their kids spending too much time together, fostering separate identities. David celebrated their inseparability. He'd watch them walk into a room together, perfectly in sync, and he would get that look on his face. A perfect union, he'd call them, his voice low and resonant. A testament to our bloodline. Purity and strength, all in one, they complete each other. At the time, I dismissed it as his typical obsession with perfection, with legacy. I told myself it was just David being David. But the words always left a small, cold splinter in my mind. It felt possessive. It felt wrong. Now, standing in the mausoleum he had built, those words echoed with a new, sinister meaning. This house wasn't a home. It was a monument to his will, a physical manifestation of his desire to control every variable, to shape flesh and blood as if it were concrete and steel. And I was its last weary caretaker. My job had been to dust the surfaces, to maintain the facade, to keep the ghosts undisturbed. But now, the caretakers were being evicted, and the ghosts were starting to talk. I looked at David's portrait again, at his smug, knowing eyes. You thought you had the last word, didn't you? You thought your will would be etched in stone forever. But you built this place to hold your secrets, David, and I'm the only one left who knows how to listen to the walls. The first official push came less than a week later. The California sun, usually so cheerful and warm, felt clinical and interrogating as it streamed into the sunroom. It glinted off the perfect white teeth of the man in the crisp Tom Ford suit who sat beside Ethan on the pristine white sofa. Ethan had called ahead. "Mom, I'm bringing someone by to chat. A friend. He has some interesting ideas about future planning." His name was Julian Croft, a lawyer from a prestigious San Francisco firm specializing in elder law and estate management. He had a handshake that was both firm and soft, a practiced, reassuring grip that felt utterly reptilian. He and Ethan sat opposite me, a united front of calm, rational concern. They had placed a glossy, heavyweight brochure on the glass coffee table between us. The cover showed a smiling, silver-haired couple playing chess in a sun-drenched garden. The title, in a gentle, looping font, read, "Seaview Meadows, the next chapter in a well-lived life." "Sophia," Julian began, his voice as smooth as the brochure paper, "Ethan has shared with me what a pillar of this family you've been. Truly remarkable." I just nodded, my hands folded in my lap. I was wearing a simple cashmere cardigan, my armor of soft, non-threatening elegance. "And because you've spent your life taking care of others," he continued, leaning forward conspiratorially, "it's time someone took care of you. We're not talking about a nursing home. Please, banish that thought. This is a lifestyle community. 5-star dining, personalized wellness programs, concierge medical services, curated social events." He gestured to the brochure as if presenting a winning lottery ticket. Ethan picked it up, his face a mask of earnest filial duty. "You won't have to worry about a thing, Mom. The upkeep on this house, it's too much. The property taxes alone are a burden. Here, everything is handled. Security, housekeeping, everything." He placed his hand on my arm. It wasn't a comforting gesture. It was a brand, a claim of ownership. It felt heavy, final. This wasn't a suggestion. It was an eviction notice wrapped in the language of therapy and concern. They spoke of my comfort, my security, my peace of mind. What they meant was their convenience, their inheritance, their freedom. Julian launched into a carefully rehearsed speech about asset protection and simplifying my estate. He used phrases like proactive transitioning and empowering your golden years. It was the most beautifully packaged, condescending speech I had ever heard. He was talking about putting me out to pasture as if he were selling me a luxury cruise. I looked at my son. I really looked at him. I saw the set of his jaw, the way his eyes flickered to the lawyer for confirmation, the slight, impatient tap of his fingers on the brochure. And in that moment, I didn't see the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the garden. I saw his father. I saw the same cold, calculating ambition that valued assets over sentiment, that saw a human life as a variable in a financial equation. David had hammered and forged and molded his son into a perfect replica of himself. The same ruthlessness, just with a better public relations team. For the first time in decades, a feeling stirred in me that was not fear or resignation or the dull ache of sorrow. It was a cold, hard stone of defiance forming in my gut. It started small, but with every word they spoke, it grew heavier, more solid. They talked about me as if I wasn't there, as if I were a piece of furniture to be moved, an estate to be liquidated. They had already written the end of my story. A small, quiet voice in my head, a voice that sounded a lot like my younger self, whispered, "Not yet." I let the silence stretch after Julian finished his pitch. I let them squirm in it just for a second. They expected tears, or perhaps a confused, grateful acquiescence. I gave them neither. I picked up the brochure, its glossy surface cool against my fingertips. I flipped through the pages, my expression unreadable. Pictures of smiling, active seniors, a golf course, a swimming pool, a library that was a quarter the size of my own. I placed it back on the table, perfectly aligned with the edge. "It's a great deal to consider," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the cold fire burning inside me. I looked from the lawyer's practiced smile to my son's anxious face. "You've given me a lot to think about." Relief washed over Ethan's features. He thought he had won. He thought the gentle push was all it would take. "Of course, Mom. Take all the time you need." "I will," I said, meeting his gaze. "I need to think." What I meant was, I needed to plan. What I meant was, game on. That night, the house settled around me with its usual groans and sighs, the familiar language of a tomb. Sleep was a distant country I had no visa for. I wasn't looking for rest. I was on a hunt. Not for anything tangible, not yet, but for a tear in the fabric of the past, a snag in the smooth, polished narrative my children had built their lives upon. The past wasn't something to be reminisced over. It was a crime scene to be investigated. My search led me upward, away from the mocking whisper of the sea and into the stagnant air of the attic. The pull-down ladder protested with a screech, dust raining down in the beam of my flashlight, a blizzard of dead skin and forgotten years. The air up here was thick, smelling of cedar, mothballs, and the dry decay of paper. It was David's archive of discarded lives, my old painting canvases, Leo's childhood toys, boxes of seasonal decorations we never used. He never threw anything away. He curated it, stored it, possessed it, even in its obsolescence. I aimed the flashlight beam across stacks of boxes and shrouded furniture, ghosts in white sheets. I was looking for one thing, the physical record. David was a man of ledgers and documents, but Isabella was a sentimentalist, a trait her father had despised in everyone but her. There, tucked under a collection of brittle Christmas ornaments, was a heavy, leather-bound chest. It wasn't locked. It never needed to be. Its weight and obscurity were security enough. I heaved the lid open, the hinges groaning in complaint. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed newspaper clippings of David's business triumphs and Ethan's collegiate sports awards, were the photo albums. I lifted one out. The cover was dark green leather, the title embossed in gold. Summers, 1990 to 1995. My hands trembled, not with weakness, but with a strange predatory anticipation. I sat on the dusty floorboards, the flashlight propped against a box, its single eye illuminating the pages. I turned past glossy images of contrived happiness. There we were at a yacht club, my smile a perfect, hollow replica of a wife's contentment. There was Ethan, puffed up with pride beside his first sports car, a gift from David. Page after page of a life that looked perfect from a distance, a life built for the camera. I felt nothing looking at them. They were props from a play I'd been forced to act in for half a century. Then I turned a page, and the air left my lungs. The breath I'd been holding for 30 years finally escaped in a ragged, silent gasp. There it was. A summer day. The light was golden, dappled by the leaves of the old oak tree near the cliffs. Ethan, a lanky teenager with the first hints of his father's arrogance in his posture, stood on the left. On the right was Isabella, barely 16, her hair long and sun-bleached, wearing a white summer dress. She was beautiful, but her smile was a brittle thing, a piece of glass about to shatter. Between them, behind them, stood David. His smile was a conqueror's. And his hand? His hand was the epicenter of the lie. It wasn't resting on his son's shoulder in a gesture of paternal pride. It was on Isabella. Not on her shoulder, but lower, splayed possessively across the small of her back, his thumb hooked into the fabric of her dress. His fingers were long and elegant, just like Ethan's were now, but on his daughter they looked like the legs of a spider, an assertion of ownership. The photograph wasn't just an image, it was a key. It unlocked a room in my mind I had bricked up and plastered over decades ago. The memory didn't trickle back. It broke like a dam. I was no longer in the dusty attic. I was downstairs, padding silently down the hallway late one night. The house was asleep. I was fetching a glass of water when I saw it. A sliver of light from under David's study door. I heard voices, low and intimate, not an argument, a murmur. Curiosity, a foolish, wifely instinct, drew me closer. I peered through the crack where the door hadn't quite latched. They weren't looking at ledgers. Isabella was curled in the large leather armchair, her bare feet tucked under her. David was kneeling in front of her, holding her hand. He was stroking the back of it with his thumb, his gaze intense, hypnotic. He was speaking, his voice a low thrum. "You are special, you know that," he was saying. "Not like the others. You and Ethan, a perfect design." Isabella just watched him, her expression rapt, a disciple at the feet of her prophet. It was the look she gave him when he praised her, a look of desperate, hungry validation. It was not a father comforting a distraught daughter. It was something else, a consecration, an anointment. Then his head turned, and his eyes, cold and dark as the ocean at midnight, met mine through the crack in the door. He didn't flinch. He didn't look guilty. He held my gaze, a silent dare. "What do you see, Sophia? What do you dare to believe?" I had fled back to my room, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Later, he came to our bedroom. He didn't storm in, angry. He was calm, disappointed. He sat on the edge of the bed and took my hand. His touch was cold. "Sophia," he'd said, his voice laced with a chillingly feigned concern. "Isabella was overwrought. A silly fight with a boy. She needs her father's reassurance. She's a sensitive girl." He paused, letting the silence hang. "For you to see something sordid in a moment of paternal comfort, it says more about your mind than it does about my actions. Perhaps you are lonelier than I realized." He had made me the deviant. He had taken my gut-wrenching intuition and twisted it into a symptom of a sick, neglected mind. And I, who had been conditioned for decades to believe in my own inadequacy, had accepted it. I had buried the memory under a mountain of shame and denial. I chose to believe I was the one who was wrong, because the alternative was too monstrous to comprehend. But sitting here now on the floor of the attic with the photograph in my lap, the monstrous was real. The photograph didn't lie. My eyes hadn't lied. The foundation of their perfect family, of my entire adult life, was built on a bed of filth. The cold fury that filled me was a revelation. It wasn't the hot, fleeting anger of an argument. It was a cold, dense star of rage collapsing inside my chest, a weight that gave me, for the first time, a sense of my own gravity. The ringing of the doorbell the next afternoon was a sharp, unwelcome sound that sliced through the house's oppressive silence. I had spent the morning in a daze, the photograph tucked away in my bedside table, a cold promise against the wood. I moved through the rooms of my house, touching the furniture, the walls, seeing them now, not as a home, but as a meticulously constructed stage set. I was expecting Ethan and his lawyer. Instead, when I opened the door, it was Leo, my grandson, my only light in this suffocating dynasty. He stood on the porch, a lanky, kind-eyed 19-year-old, all sharp angles and awkward grace, clutching his phone like a lifeline. He saw the world through a screen, a world of fast cuts and fleeting fame that I could barely comprehend. He was a streamer on a platform called Twitch, a fact that baffled and secretly delighted me. He had found a way to build his own world, away from the gilded cage of his parents' legacy. "Graham," he said, his brow furrowed with genuine concern. He stepped inside and gave me a hug that was both hesitant and warm. "Are you okay? Dad called. He said you weren't feeling well, that you're confused." The word hung in the air between us. Confused. The official narrative. The first stone laid in the path to have me declared incompetent. The hypocrisy was a physical thing, a wave of nausea that rose in my throat. I steered him toward the kitchen, forcing a placid smile. "Your father worries too much. I'm just tired." "Yeah, well." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. He didn't want to be here, playing the role of the dutiful grandson checking on his dotty grandmother. He wanted to be in his room, with his audience, in a world where he was in control. To break the tension, he pulled out his phone. "Hey, check it out. Mom just posted this." He held the screen up to me. It was a video, a montage from the anniversary party, cut to some overwrought, trending pop ballad about timeless love. There were quick, shimmering shots of Ethan and Isabella, dancing, clinking champagne glasses, kissing for the camera. The setting sun behind them cast a theatrical orange glow over the whole scene. It was a masterpiece of curated reality. Then he scrolled down, showing me the comments. An endless stream of praise from strangers. Had relationship goals. 25 years is amazing, such an inspiration. Your parents are the definition of true love. I wish my parents loved each other like this. Inspirational love story. The phrase was so obscene, so grotesquely false, that I had to grip the edge of the counter to steady myself. This was their weapon, a lie so public, so celebrated, that the truth would sound like the ravings of a lunatic. They were inoculating the world against me. I looked at Leo, his face lit by the phone's glow, oblivious. He was their son. The product of this grand, sick performance. And in that moment, I knew two things with absolute certainty. I had to burn their world to the ground, and I had to save him from the fire. The path forward was a razor's edge. I had to weaponize the truth without letting it slice him to ribbons. He was the only innocent in this entire tragedy. I put my hand over his on the phone, gently pushing it down. My voice was soft, laced with a manufactured nostalgia. "It's a beautiful video, dear," I said, my tone a careful construct of grandmotherly affection. "They do look very happy." I let a beat of silence pass, as if lost in thought. "You know, Leo," I began, my voice gentle, almost a whisper. "It's funny, the things you remember as you get older. I was just thinking about how your parents met. Did they ever tell you the full story? I mean, the real story, from the very beginning?" He shrugged, his attention already starting to drift back to his phone. "I don't know." "High school sweethearts, right? The usual." "Something like that," I said, keeping my voice light. I walked to the sink and turned on the tap, my back to him. It was easier to plant the seed without looking him in the eye. "Your grandfather, David?" He was so proud of their bond, unusually so. He used to talk about it all the time, even when they were just kids. He called it a perfect design. He felt he had a hand in it, that it was fated. I let the word hang in the air just as David had. Fated. I was borrowing from the architect's own vocabulary. I turned back to him, drying my hands on a towel, my expression serene. "It's just an old woman's ramblings. Pay me no mind." He gave me a distracted smile. "It's cool, Graham. Hey, I gotta go. I have a stream scheduled in an hour." He gave me another quick hug and was gone, his car crunching on the gravel driveway as he sped back to his digital reality. He was oblivious. The seed was planted in barren soil, for now. He hadn't noticed the tremor in my voice or the strange intensity in my words. For him, it was just a quaint, rambling question from his grandmother, who was, as his father had said, a little confused. But for me, it was the first deliberate cut, the first careful, precise incision. It wasn't just a question. It was the sharpening of a knife. The word I had used, fated, echoed in the empty kitchen. It was David's word. It clung to the air like the scent of his cigars, a phantom of his suffocating influence. He was a man obsessed with legacy, with designs, with control that reached beyond the grave. And that's when another memory surfaced, not from a photograph, but from the deep well of his endless boasting. He'd been standing on the veranda, gesturing to the house, the cliffs, the roaring ocean below. "This house is my true testament, Sophia," he had boomed, his voice full of that messianic certainty. "More than any skyscraper. Its secrets are built into its very bones." For years, I dismissed it as the ravings of a narcissist, a madman's metaphor. But what if it wasn't? What if the man who designed his own children's lives with such perverse precision had done the same with his architecture? His office had been left largely untouched since his death, a museum of his ego. I pushed open the heavy oak door. The air was stale, still holding a faint, spectral trace of his cologne and the leather of his chair. It was a room designed to intimidate, all dark wood and towering bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes he'd never read. I went to the filing cabinets first, locked, of course, but I had lived with him for 50 years. I knew his vanities. The key wasn't in a desk drawer. It was hidden in plain sight, a display of his own cleverness, taped to the bottom of the heavy, globe-shaped paperweight on his desk. Inside the cabinet, under files marked with the names of soulless corporations and real estate ventures, was a long, cylindrical tube. My heart began to beat a heavy, painful rhythm against my ribs. I pulled it out and carried it to the massive desk, sweeping aside a layer of dust. I unrolled the contents, the original blueprints of the house, dated 1975. The paper was thick, yellowed at the edges, and crackled as I smoothed it flat. The scent of old ink and paper filled the room. It was all there. David's mind laid out in a language of lines, angles, and measurements. The grand foyer, the sprawling living room, the master suite with its panoramic windows facing the sea. It was a blueprint for a prison, however beautiful. I spent hours, hunched over the desk, a magnifying glass clutched in my hand, my old eyes straining to trace every line. The sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. My back ached, my eyes burned, but I couldn't stop. I was a detective on a cold case, and the victim was my own life. I scanned the plans for the main floors, the guest wings, the garage, nothing. Then, I found the foundation plan, the sub-basement. It was mostly dedicated to utilities, the boiler, the water heater, wine storage, a labyrinth of concrete and pipes. My finger traced the thick lines of the foundation walls, following the perimeter. And then, I saw it. My breath caught in my throat. It was an anomaly, a ghost in the machine. In the deepest, most inaccessible part of the sub-basement, behind the thick concrete wall of the wine cellar, there was a void, a large rectangular space, roughly 20 by 30 feet. It wasn't labeled. It didn't connect to any structural supports, any plumbing, any electrical lines. It was a deliberately hidden dead space, a concrete box buried in the earth beneath the house. And in the center of the rectangle, the architect had drawn a small, strange symbol. 2 interlocking circles. A symbol for marriage, for union. A symbol I had never seen on any architectural plan. A cold sweat broke out on my brow. My heart, which had been hammering, seemed to stop altogether. This was it. This was the secret in the bones of the house. David's boast wasn't a metaphor. It was a map. He hadn't just built a house. He had built a vault. The confirmation of the hidden room shifted something in me. The abstract horror now had a physical location, a destination. My fight was no longer just against memories and lies. It was against concrete and steel. The next 2 days passed in a haze of quiet, focused planning. I researched contractors online, looking for a small, independent operator, someone who wouldn't be connected to Ethan's vast network of corporate contacts. But before I could make the call, the world outside the house intruded once more. I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive, but this time it wasn't a familiar car. It was a courier's van, clinical and white. The doorbell chimed, sharp and impersonal. A young man in a uniform handed me a stiff, oversized envelope and a digital scanner to sign. My hand was steady as I scrawled my name. I closed the door and leaned against it, the envelope feeling cold and heavy in my hand. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize, their name embossed in stark black letters. I walked into the living room and slid it open with a letter opener from David's desk. The papers inside were thick, dense with a language designed to alienate and intimidate, but the message, stripped of its jargon, was brutally clear. It was a formal notice, a notice of hearing for petition for conservatorship. My children were formally, legally, declaring me mentally incompetent. I sank into an armchair, the papers trembling in my hand. I read the accusations, the supposed evidence they had compiled. Lapses in memory, it cited. My refusal to accept their manufactured version of the past. Erratic behavior. My search through the attic, my quiet defiance. Inability to manage personal affairs and finances. My refusal to sign the papers to sell the house. Paranoia and delusions, it concluded, mentioning I had made unfounded and disturbing insinuations about the family. My question to Leo. They were twisting every act of self-preservation, every flicker of rebellion, into a symptom of dementia. They were building a legal cage around me, using my sanity as the bars. The walls of the great room, which had once felt so vast, suddenly seemed to shrink. The ceaseless roar of the ocean outside the window no longer sounded like nature's power. It sounded like laughter, mocking and cruel. A surge of pure, primal terror washed over me, cold and suffocating. It was the old fear, the one I had lived with for 50 years under David's reign, the feeling of being trapped, of having your reality denied, your own mind used as a weapon against you. For a moment, I was that young wife again, helpless and alone, convinced of my own madness. But then, something else rose up from beneath the fear. It was that new thing inside me, that cold, hard stone of rage that had been forming since the anniversary party. The fear receded, leaving behind a crystalline clarity. They had learned their father's tactics of gaslighting and manipulation, but they had inherited none of his patience or subtlety. They were clumsy. They were moving too fast. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They saw a frail old woman, a relic to be discarded, lost in her memories. They had forgotten who I was. They had forgotten that I had not just lived with their creator, I had survived him. I had weathered 50 years of his quiet, soul-crushing psychological warfare, and I was still standing. He was a master of the game. They were just children playing with his tools, and they had just shown me their entire hand. I looked from the legal papers to the blueprints spread on the coffee table. They thought they were building a case. They had no idea I was about to excavate a tomb. The sound of the drill was a scream trapped in concrete. For 2 days, it was the house's new heartbeat, a violent, shuddering pulse that ran up from the foundation and into the fillings of my teeth. I sat in the living room, a cup of untouched tea growing cold on the table beside me, and I listened. I imagined the diamond-tipped bit grinding against the aggregate and steel rebar David had insisted on, his obsession with permanence, with building things that could never be broken. I had called a man named Henderson, a local contractor whose face was a roadmap of sun and hard work. His father had been one of David's go-to foremen decades ago, a detail I hoped would buy me a certain kind of loyalty, or at least a professional silence. "Seismic retrofitting, Mrs. Davenport?" he'd asked, standing in the cold, damp air of the sub-basement, his powerful flashlight beam cutting through the gloom and landing on the spot from the blueprints. "This house is built like a bunker. You could park a tank on the roof." My husband was thorough, I said, the word tasting like ash. He once mentioned a structural anomaly, a void. He was worried it could compromise the foundation in a significant quake. "I just want peace of mind." It was a plausible lie. David's paranoia was legendary. "A void, huh?" Henderson ran a thick, calloused hand over the smooth, seamless concrete. He knocked on it. The sound was a dull, final thud. "Feels solid as a mountain to me, but you're the boss. I'll pay double your usual rate, in cash. And I need your discretion." My children, they worry about me. They think I'm being foolish with money. I'd rather they not know about this until it's done. I watched his eyes. He wasn't a greedy man, but he was a practical one. He had a business to run, a family to feed. He saw a worried old woman with more money than sense, looking for a way to feel safe. He nodded slowly. "All right, Mrs. Davenport. Discretion it is. But this is going to be loud and messy." It was more than messy. It was an excavation. For 48 hours, the house groaned. Dust, fine as silt, settled on every surface, a pale gray shroud over David's polished world. I didn't mind. It felt like the house was finally exhaling. During the long nights, when Henderson and his crew were gone, I'd go down to the basement, the air thick with the smell of pulverized stone. I'd place my hand on the wall near the drilling, feeling the residual warmth. I was close. The thought didn't thrill me. It settled in my stomach like a cold, heavy stone. This wasn't about discovery. It was about confirmation. On the afternoon of the second day, the screaming stopped. Silence descended, so sudden and absolute it was disorienting. I heard Henderson's heavy boots on the basement stairs. I met him at the bottom, my heart a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. He was wiping sweat and gray dust from his brow with the back of his arm. He looked tired and deeply, profoundly baffled. "Mrs. Davenport," he began, his voice low, respectful, but edged with confusion. "We're through. But this wasn't an anomaly. This wasn't a mistake in the pour." He gestured with his flashlight toward the ragged, perfectly rectangular hole they had carved out of the wall. "Someone built a sealed room down here, on purpose, lined with more rebar than a bridge support." My gaze followed his beam of light. Past the jagged edges of broken concrete, there was darkness. And in that darkness, something reflected the light with a cold, industrial sheen. Not dirt, not bedrock. It was a steel door. Henderson and his men packed up their tools, their faces a mixture of professional curiosity and a clear desire to be done with the strangeness of this house. I transferred the doubled fee to his business account through my phone, a quiet, digital transaction that felt jarringly modern in the dusty, ancient-feeling basement. He nodded his thanks, his expression still troubled. "If you need someone to deal with that door, you let me know, Mrs. Davenport. Be careful." He didn't ask what was behind it. He didn't want to know. After the sound of his truck faded down the long driveway, the silence of the house returned, but it was different now. It was a listening silence. The house, the cliff, the ocean. They were all waiting. I walked back down the stairs, each step an echo in the vast emptiness. The air flowing from the hole was cold, stale. It smelled of time and enclosure. The steel door was formidable, gray and featureless except for a simple, recessed handle. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, and turned it. There was no resistance. It wasn't locked. David hadn't been worried about anyone getting in. He had been worried about what was inside ever getting out. The door swung inward with a low groan of unused hinges. The air that washed over me was a physical presence, a current of cold that smelled of dust, dried velvet, and something else. A faint, cloying sweetness, like flowers left to decay in a sealed jar. It was the smell of secrets. I fumbled for the light switch just inside the doorway. An old-fashioned pull cord. I tugged it. A single bare bulb flickered to life, casting a stark yellow-white glare over the space within. It was a room, not a void. A small, windowless chamber, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet. The walls were paneled in a dark, almost black wood, and one wall was covered by a heavy curtain of deep red velvet, absorbing the light, making the space feel smaller, suffocating. It felt like a perversion of a confessional or a private, profane chapel. In the exact center of the room stood a pedestal. It was carved from a single block of polished black marble, rising from the floor like a sacrificial altar. It was bare. My eyes scanned the rest of the room. The other walls weren't empty. They were lined with narrow, custom-built shelves, and on those shelves sat 25 identical rosewood boxes. They were beautiful, exquisitely crafted. Each one was inlaid with a delicate, stylized number in gleaming silver. I stepped closer. 1, 2, 3. They continued in perfect sequence, all the way to 25, an anniversary gift for every year of their marriage. My mind flashed back to the party. to Isabella's shimmering dress and Ethan's smug pronouncements about their perfect union. 25 years. I reached out and touched the box marked 1. The wood was cool and smooth beneath my fingertips. I tried to lift the lid. It was locked. I tried 25. Locked. I moved along the wall, trying each one at random. All of them were sealed tight. A cold certainty began to rise in me, an understanding so absolute it felt like a memory. The keys. Where would David, a man who fetishized control and symbolism, hide the keys to his most private monument? My mind conjured his image, not as the frail man he was at the end, but the titan who had dominated my life. Sitting at the head of the dinner table, his hand resting on the polished wood. And on his finger, the ring. It was a hideous thing. An ornate, oversized monstrosity of twisted gold bands and strange geometric carvings. He never, ever took it off. It was a symbol of his power, his wealth, his impenetrable self. After he died, I'd expected it to be buried with him. But Ethan, ever the devoted acolyte, had started wearing it. A son honoring his father, he'd said, a legacy passed down. I had seen it on his hand just a few days ago when he'd come with the lawyer, the glint of it as he gestured, explaining the benefits of the facility he'd chosen for me. I stood there in the cold, stale air of that secret room, the bare bulb buzzing overhead. And I knew. The ring wasn't just a ring. It wasn't just a legacy. It was the key to this profane sanctuary, the key that would unlock every last one of his sins. And my son was wearing it. The conservatorship hearing was scheduled for the next morning. My final gambit had to be played that night. I picked up my phone, my fingers surprisingly steady. I scrolled to Ethan's name. My voice, when I spoke, was a carefully crafted instrument of maternal frailty. "Ethan, darling," I began, injecting a slight tremor. "I know tomorrow is going to be difficult. For all of us." "Mother," he replied, his tone clipped, businesslike. "It's for the best. You'll be safe and cared for. We've been over this." I know you believe that." I let a small, defeated sigh escape my lips. "I was hoping. Could you come for dinner tonight? A final family meal in this house, please. And bring Leo. I want my grandson to be here. When we say goodbye to this chapter." There was a pause. I could hear him weighing the request. It was sentimental. It was theatrical. It was exactly the kind of thing a confused, emotional old woman would ask for. It fit his narrative perfectly. His victory lap. "Of course, Mother," he said finally, his voice softening with magnanimity. "We'll be there at 7. I spent the afternoon preparing. Not a feast, but a simple, elegant meal. Roast chicken, potatoes, a green salad. The kind of comforting, unpretentious food that spoke of home, of family, of everything this house was supposed to be. I set the table in the grand dining room, using the good china and the silver David had been so proud of. The entire act was a piece of theater, and I was the lead actress, director, and playwright. They arrived precisely at 7. Ethan, looking self-important in a tailored blazer. Isabella, a ghost at his side, her eyes shadowed, her smile a fragile, painted-on thing. And Leo. My dear Leo. His face a mask of worry and love. He came to me first, wrapping his strong young arms around me. "Graham," he whispered into my hair. "Are you okay?" "I will be, my love," I murmured back, holding him tightly for a moment. "I'm so glad you're here." Dinner was an exercise in suffocating tension. Ethan did most of the talking, pontificating about the markets, about a new acquisition his firm was making. He was performing for Leo, showcasing the power and success that awaited an heir to the Davenport name. Isabella picked at her food, saying nothing, her eyes darting from Ethan to me and back again. Leo tried to bridge the chasm, asking me about my garden, telling a funny story about one of his college classes. He was trying to knit us together, unaware that the fabric was already rotten beyond repair. I played my part. I was quiet, withdrawn, my gaze distant. I let my hand tremble slightly as I lifted my wine glass. I gave them the gift of my surrender. After the meal, as we sat with coffee, the silence stretched, thick and heavy. This was the moment. I turned my gaze to Ethan. I let my eyes fill with a fabricated well of sorrow and nostalgia. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice just above the sound of the ticking grandfather clock in the hall. I reached out my hand, palm up, across the polished expanse of the table. "Your father's ring." He looked down at his hand, at the grotesque gold band. A flicker of pride crossed his face. "May I see it?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. "Just one last time, to remember him." It was the perfect bait. An appeal to his vanity, his sense of patriarchal duty, his belief in my utter defeat. He saw a broken mother clinging to a memory of the great man who had built their world. He was flattered. His arrogance was his undoing. With a magnanimous smile, he worked the heavy ring off his finger. It was snug, a part of him now. He placed it in my outstretched palm. It felt cold and heavy, a dense weight of secrets. "Of course, Mother," he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity. I closed my fingers around it. I didn't look at it. I looked at him, then at Isabella. I held their gazes. Leo watched, a frown of confusion on his face. In the quiet of the dining room, I began to work. My fingers, which they believed were clumsy with age, moved with a speed and precision born of 1,000 mental rehearsals. There was a small, almost invisible seam along one of the carved bands. I pressed it. A faint click. I twisted the main body of the ring to the left. Another, more solid click. The ornate face of the ring popped open on a tiny hinge, like a locket. But inside, there was no space for a picture. There was only a mechanism. I pushed the central gold knot downwards, and the entire structure came apart in my palm into 3 distinct pieces. Nestled within the hollowed-out frame lay a set of small, intricately shaped keys. One was long and thin, another short and wide with a triangular head. A third was almost hook-like. They weren't jewelry, they were tools. I let the pieces of the ring and the keys rest in my open palm for all of them to see. The color drained from Ethan's face. It was instantaneous, as if a plug had been pulled. His skin went from a healthy, confident tan to a sickly, grayish white. His mouth fell slightly open. Beside him, Isabella let out a tiny, choked gasp, her hand flying to her throat. Her eyes, wide with a terror so pure it was almost beautiful, locked with his. And in that shared look of absolute, soul-stripping horror, I had my confession. It was more eloquent than any words, more damning than any signed document. It was the silent, screaming truth. Leo looked from their faces to my hand and back again, his confusion curdling into a dawning fear. What is that? What's wrong?" I closed my hand into a fist, the sharp edges of the keys digging into my skin. The feeling grounded me. The frail, trembling woman was gone. My voice, when I spoke, did not shake. It was as cold and hard as the marble altar waiting in the basement below. "There is one last part of your father's legacy you need to see," I said. I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. I didn't need to raise my voice. The authority in the room had shifted, its gravitational center now residing entirely within me. Ethan remained frozen, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning catastrophe. Isabella looked as if she might shatter. "Come with me," I commanded. It wasn't a request. I led the way out of the dining room, through the silent hall, toward the basement door. The sound of their footsteps followed me. Mine, steady. Leo's, hesitant and questioning. Ethan's, heavy, dragging. Isabella's, a frantic, barely audible shuffle. "Graham, what is this?" Leo asked, his voice a low, worried murmur behind me. "What's going on? Mom? Dad?" They didn't answer him. They couldn't. I opened the door and descended into the familiar dampness, flipping on the string of bare bulbs that lit the way. I didn't stop at the main level. I continued down to the sub-basement, to the newly carved wound in the foundation. The jagged hole gaped at us, a dark mouth leading to a deeper darkness. "What in God's name?" Ethan finally spoke, his voice a hoarse whisper, as he saw the violation of his father's perfect construction. God has nothing to do with this, I said, stepping through the opening. I pulled the cord for the light inside. The stark yellow glare filled the small, velvet-draped room, illuminating the black marble altar and the silent, waiting rows of rosewood boxes. Leo followed me in, his eyes wide as he took in the bizarre, chapel-like space. What is this place? Ethan and Isabella stopped at the threshold, two figures silhouetted against the light of the basement, refusing to enter the tomb their father had built for them. "Come in," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "You need to see the archives, your archives." Reluctantly, as if drawn by a force they could no longer resist, they stepped inside. The air grew thick with their fear. I walked to the shelves. My hand was steady as I selected the first key, the long, thin one. I found the box inlaid with a silver 1. The key slid into a tiny, almost invisible lock. It turned with a well-oiled click. I lifted the lid. I turned and held it out for them to see. For Leo to see. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded black satin, was not a jewel or a bond certificate. It was a photograph, a Polaroid, its colors slightly washed out by time. It showed a secret ceremony, a teenage boy with Ethan's unmistakable face, looking both proud and terrified. And beside him, a girl, barely a woman, her face pale and solemn beneath a makeshift veil. It was Isabella. Standing between them, his hands on their shoulders, beaming with a creator's unholy pride, was David. He was officiating. He was marrying his own children. Leo took a sharp, ragged breath. "What? What is that? Is that a joke?" "Your father didn't joke about his work," I said, my voice flat. I closed the lid and placed the box on the altar. I took the second key. I moved to the box marked 2. I opened it. Inside was a single lock of blonde hair tied with a dried, brittle ribbon. I moved to the box marked 3. A collection of dried flowers, the kind a boy would pick for a girl from a field, pressed under glass. Secret bouquets. I didn't need to be theatrical. The truth was the theater. I began to move faster, a grim priestess performing a long overdue sacrament. I opened another box, and another. 8, 15, 21. Each one contained a trophy from their unholy union, a piece of their manufactured love story, a concert ticket stub, a silver locket, a childish drawing of a house by the sea, each one a testament to a year of their lives, curated and preserved by their master. Ethan finally broke. "Stop it!" he choked out, lunging forward as if to stop me. "No," I said, my voice cracking like a whip. "You will watch. You will see it all." He flinched back as if I had struck him. Isabella was openly weeping now, silent tears streaming down her face, her body shaking uncontrollably. I saved the most important for last. Scattered among the later years were small, leather-bound journals, their covers stamped with David's initials. I opened one. His handwriting was as I remembered, meticulous, precise, utterly without emotion. It was the script of a god documenting his experiment. I began to read aloud. Entry 43, Year 6. Ethan exhibits appropriate possessiveness. Isabella responds with requisite submission. The bond I have forged is strengthening. They believe their feelings are their own. This is the critical element. Their love must feel authentic to them. A discovery, not a design. It is my greatest creation. I flipped a few pages. Entry 97, Year 11. I have explained the necessity of secrecy. The world is not ready for a love so pure, so perfectly engineered. They see it as a beautiful, tragic burden. This narrative will bind them closer than any public vows. Their isolation is their strength. I looked up. Leo was staring at the journal in my hands, his face utterly white, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. He understood now. He was looking at the blueprint for his own existence. I picked up the final journal from the box marked 25. The 25th year, the culmination, the dynasty is secure. Leo is proof of the concept. He carries the best of both lines, a perfect synthesis. My legacy is not in brick or steel, it is in blood. They have done well. My masterpiece is complete. The journal fell from my fingers, landing with a soft thud on the concrete floor. The room was silent, save for Isabella's quiet sobs. Leo looked from me to the open boxes, to the horrified, shattered faces of the two people he called his parents. The understanding that crashed down upon him was a tidal wave, wiping away his past, his identity, his entire world. His parents' marriage wasn't a love story he'd seen them post about on Instagram. It wasn't an inspiration. It was a monument to his grandfather's monstrous, narcissistic ego. And he was its living, breathing product. His breath, which he'd been holding, escaped him in a single, tearing sob. It was not the sound of a boy's sadness. It was the sound of a soul breaking. There was no explosion, no cathartic scream that tore through the foundation of the house. There was only a silence that was heavier than the concrete tomb David had built around us. It was a vacuum, pulling all sound, all air, all life from the room. The only noise was the frantic, useless beat of my own heart, a drum signaling a victory no one would ever celebrate. Ethan didn't fall so much as deflate. The tailored lines of his expensive suit, the one that made him look so much like his father, suddenly seemed too large for him. He slid down the rough, poured concrete wall, his back scraping against it with a soft, rasping sound, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He didn't try to stop his descent. He landed in a heap on the floor, his head bowed, his hands limp at his sides. The signet ring, David's key and his crown, was a glint of obscene gold against the gray dust. He stared at the floor, at a spot between his polished Italian shoes, as if the answers to the universe were written there in the grime. His breathing was ragged, a series of short, sharp gasps that were swallowed by the oppressive quiet. The master of the universe, the man who had come with a lawyer to declare me incompetent, was reduced to a pile of expensive fabric and broken pride. Isabella was different. She didn't collapse. She froze. It was a terrifying stillness, as if a sculptor had captured her at the precise moment of her soul's death. She stood before the open mahogany box, the one containing the brittle, yellowed photograph of their secret adolescent wedding ceremony. Her hand was outstretched, hovering just above the image, her fingers curled slightly as if to touch it, to see if it was real, but she couldn't complete the motion. Her face, always a masterpiece of careful curation, of subtle makeup and practiced smiles, had been wiped clean. It was blank. The perfect bone structure, the clear skin, the elegant arch of her brows. They were all still there, but they were just features on a mask with nothing behind it. The light from the single bare bulb overhead caught the shimmer on her eyelids, a last vestige of the glamorous woman who had existed just moments before. Now, it just made her look like a beautiful, discarded doll. She stared and stared into that box, as if she could unsee what was inside, as if her will alone could turn the photograph back into a piece of blank paper, the lock of hair back into nothing. And Leo, my grandson, stood between them, a living, breathing testament to the horror enshrined in these walls. He was the product of this grand, perverse design. His gaze darted from his father's slumped form to his mother's catatonic stillness, then to the damning evidence in the boxes. I watched the realization dawn, not as a sudden flash, but as a slow, creeping poison through his veins. The color drained from his face. His jaw, usually so relaxed and youthful, was clenched tight. He looked at the photograph, then at his parents' faces, then back again, the pieces of his entire life rearranging themselves into a monstrous mosaic. The inspirational love story he had been told, the one his parents monetized on social media with saccharine posts and How I'd Couple Goals hashtags, was a lie. Not just a lie, but a meticulously constructed cage built by a monster, and his parents were its willing, gilded inhabitants. He was the prize exhibit. I watched him. My heart ached for him, a physical pain in my chest. This was the cost of my freedom. The price of justice was my grandson's innocence. I had known there would be collateral damage, but seeing it etched onto his young face was a separate, more profound kind of hell. He took a staggering step back, his shoe scuffing the floor. The sound, so small, was like a gunshot in the tomb-like silence. It broke the spell. Ethan's head lifted slowly. His eyes, the same cold blue as his father's, found mine. There was no anger left in them, no arrogance, just a hollow, bottomless abyss. He didn't speak. What was there to say? I had not just uncovered a secret. I had detonated the core of their identity. The conservatorship, the legal threats, the condescending concern, it all evaporated, revealed as the pathetic posturing it had always been. They weren't trying to protect me from my weakness. They were trying to bury their own. I could have called the police. I had thought about it. I had imagined the flashing lights painting the cliffside red and blue, the officers in their stiff uniforms, the cold language of a police report. But as I looked at the wreckage of my children, I knew that the law was a blunt, inadequate instrument for a crime, this intricate, this personal. A prison sentence would be a release. It would give them a narrative of victimhood, a way to frame themselves as pawns in their father's game. It would give them an end date. What I was giving them was far more severe. Their prison was this room. Their prison was the truth, living inside them, breathing in the air around them, poisoning every memory they had ever shared. Their life sentence was knowing that their son, the boy they had raised on a foundation of lies, now saw them with perfect, horrifying clarity. They would have to look at him every day and see their sin reflected in his eyes. There is no parole from that. Leo finally turned his gaze from his parents to me. His eyes were wide with a universe of pain, but in their depths, I saw something else. A flicker of understanding. A silent, desperate plea. He took another step, this time towards me. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply reached out and took my hand. His was trembling, the fine bones of his youthful fingers cold and slick with sweat, but his grip was firm. It was an anchor. He was choosing, not between his parents and me, but between the lie and the truth. He squeezed my hand once, a small convulsive gesture, and then began to lead me towards the stairs. I let him. I didn't look back at Ethan, still slumped against the wall like a marionette with its strings cut. I didn't look back at Isabella, still frozen in her private nightmare. I had seen enough. We were leaving them in the crypt David had built for them, surrounded by the relics of their unholy union. Let them suffocate on the truth. Each step up the concrete stairs was a deliberate act of severance. The air grew warmer, cleaner, as we ascended. When Leo pushed open the door to the main basement, the familiar, slightly musty smell of the old house felt like fresh mountain air by comparison. He didn't let go of my hand. We walked through the main part of the house, past the wine cellar, past the laundry room, our footsteps the only sound. Upstairs, in the grand foyer with its vaulted ceilings and sea-facing windows, the silence was different. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of the secret room. This was a new kind of quiet, an empty quiet. For 50 years, this house had been saturated with David's presence. His ego was in the architecture, his will was in the art on the walls, his ghost echoed in every hallway. Even after he was gone, his influence lingered, a toxic residue that clung to everything, especially to Ethan and Isabella. Now, it was gone. The bomb I had detonated in the basement had created a shockwave that had finally, blessedly, cleansed this place. It was just a house now. Wood, glass, and stone. The ghost had been exorcised. Leo led me to the large armchair by the panoramic window. He sat me down gently, as if I were made of glass. The ocean outside was a sheet of black ink under a starless sky. The rhythmic crash of the waves against the cliffs below, a sound that had been the soundtrack to my entire married life, was just a sound now. It was no longer the furious heartbeat of my gilded cage. It was just the sea. Leo knelt before me, still clutching my hand. He finally looked at me, really looked at me, and his face crumbled. A single tear traced a path through the youthful stubble on his cheek. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice cracking. It was the only word spoken since we had left the basement. I raised my free hand and wiped the tear from his face. "It's over, Leo," I said, my own voice raspy. "It's all over." We stayed like that for a long time, holding hands in the dark, silent house, while the ocean kept its steady, indifferent rhythm, and the wreckage of a family lay buried in the foundation beneath our feet. 6 months slid by, not like a turning page, but like a slow tide receding, leaving behind a new and unfamiliar shoreline. The cliffside mansion in Carmel became a ghost of a different sort. I saw it once, by accident. I was scrolling through my tablet, a device Leo had patiently taught me to use, and an article popped up on a high-end real estate blog. Mystery sale of iconic Carmel cliff dwelling, the headline read. There was a drone shot of the house, looking majestic and remote against the churning Pacific. The article speculated about the anonymous buyer, a tech billionaire or a foreign magnate, perhaps. It mentioned the previous owners, the power couple, Ethan and Isabella Vance, and their sudden, inexplicable disappearance from the social scene. Their Instagram, a monument to a perfect life, had gone dark. Their last post was a smiling selfie from their anniversary party, the night it all came down. The comments section was a flurry of gossip and speculation. A messy divorce, a financial scandal. No one guessed the truth. The truth was too grotesque for public consumption. I closed the browser and never looked back. I never set foot in that house again after that night. It was sold through lawyers, a series of sterile emails and wire transfers. A clean cut. Now, my world is small and quiet. Leo and I live in Oregon, in a little house with a garden that smells of damp earth and pine needles. The air here is clean, cool, and thin. It doesn't carry the heavy, salt-laced weight of the past. The quiet here isn't empty, it's full. It's filled with the sound of birds in the Douglas firs, the hum of the refrigerator, the gentle clink of my teacup against its saucer. It is a real quiet, an earned quiet. We are two survivors of a shipwreck no one else ever saw. We don't talk about the storm, not directly. The words are too heavy, too sharp. They would tear open the fragile scars we are so carefully trying to heal. Instead, we talk around it. We build a new life in the spaces between the words. We plant a vegetable garden. I teach Leo my mother's recipe for tomato sauce, our hands dusted with flour in the small, sunlit kitchen. He shows me how to identify constellations in the clear, dark sky, so different from the hazy, light-polluted nights in Carmel. He's taking online courses at the local community college, studying botany. He says he likes learning about how things grow. Sometimes, I watch him when he doesn't know I'm looking. I see the shadow that still passes through his eyes when he thinks he's alone. I know he's seeing that room, those boxes, the shattered faces of his parents. I know the truth is a burden he will carry for the rest of his life. I gave him a terrible knowledge, but I also gave him a chance to grow in clean soil, away from the poison of his family tree. I lost my children. That is a fact, stark and brutal. I grieve for them, but it's a strange, complicated grief. I don't mourn the man and woman I left in that basement. They were strangers to me, monsters sculpted by my husband. I mourn the little boy with bright blue eyes who used to fall asleep in my lap, and the little girl who loved to collect seashells on the beach. I mourn the children they could have been, the children David stole from them and from me long before I ever found those boxes. I lost them to a truth more terrible than death. But in doing so, I saved my grandson. And in a way I am only just beginning to understand. I saved myself. For 50 years, I lived a life that was not my own. I was an accessory in David's grand design. My thoughts, my desires, my very identity were shaped and constrained by the walls of that house, by the force of his will. I was Sophia, the wife of David Vance. Then I was Sophia, the mother of Ethan and Isabella. Then, almost, I was Sophia, the senile old woman in a luxury care facility. I was always defined by someone else, by my relationship to them. This morning, I woke before the sun. I made myself a cup of strong black tea and sat on my small wooden porch. A light mist was clinging to the tops of the pine trees, and the air was cold enough to make my breath fog. I watched as the sky slowly brightened, from a deep indigo to a soft, pearly gray, then to a blaze of gentle pink and orange. It was a new sunrise. There was no crashing ocean, no violent, dramatic beauty. There was just a quiet, steady light spreading across the landscape, promising a new day. I held the warm mug in my hands, feeling the heat seep into my fingers. And for the first time in my life, I felt a profound, unshakable sense of peace. The house behind me was mine. The garden was mine. The quiet was mine. This sunrise, this gentle, hopeful light. It felt, finally, like it was my own. The path to this sunrise was through a long and terrible darkness. It forced me to confront the ugliest of truths, to make an impossible choice, and to destroy the very family I once thought was my world. But what do you do when the foundations of your family are built on a crime? Do you protect the structure, or do you save the people trapped inside? I'd be interested to know what you would have done in my shoes. Let me know in the comments below.